Welcome to the Brute Strength Podcast, bringing you worldwide experts from all areas of health and fitness. We cover training, nutrition, coaching, and mindset. Welcome your host, strength and conditioning coach, 2012 and 2013 CrossFit Games champ, Michael Cazayoux. Mind, body, brute.
Hey, and welcome back. This is Mike Cazayoux, and you're listening to the Brute Strength Podcast. This week, I've got Robb Wolf on the show. Robb is a two-time New York Times bestselling author. He wrote The Paleo Solution and Wired to Eat. He also has one of the top podcasts in the entire health category on iTunes, and in general is one of the foremost thought leaders in the nutrition world in the world. There are two main things that I love about Robb. One is his consistency over time. Robb has been preaching a lot of the same principles for 10 to 20 years. And yes, he's evolving, but he has been steadfast in his message about paleo and living a life, eating nutrient-dense whole foods for so long. He was so ahead of the curve, and he has just stuck to it and continues to teach so much in this world. The second is his ability to hold different beliefs at the same time. So a lot of people most people like to be in certain camps. They like to be a paleo guy or a keto guy or a vegan or whatever it may be. And I just don't think that life works in black and whites. I think there's almost always a lot of gray area. And so when I find experts that are able to play in that gray area and hold contradictory beliefs at the same time, they're just so much more believable and compelling. And Robb is one of those guys. We start out by talking about what is cutting edge in the paleo movement. And I know that's kind of a funny way of putting it. What is cutting edge? We talk about an interesting story of him meeting Sublime. We talk about his story of getting into the low carb and paleo world in the first place. We go into eating for longevity versus performance versus body composition. That's always a fascinating topic for me. I ask him a question. If you had to focus on either quantity or quality, or you're working with someone that wants to lose body fat and wants to focus on body composition primarily first, what would you focus on, quantity versus quality? And this is a question that I've asked a lot of nutrition experts, and slowly but surely I'm starting to build kind of a 360 view with a lot of different perspectives. So I ask him that question. We talk about the common advice that he gives out that the fewest people actually implement. We talk about what the most frustrating piece of advice he sees nutrition coaches giving. And finally, we talk about something that is of a lot of interest to both of us, which is jiu-jitsu and how certain principles apply to life in general. Robb is an absolutely fascinating guy, and I learned a ton on this episode. I know you're going to enjoy it. So without further ado, please welcome Robb Wolf. Hey, before we start this show, I want to let you know about something I'm super pumped about right now, which is that I started a second podcast. It's called the WAG Podcast, and I do it with my wife, Adi Cazayoux. And the reason that we started this second show is because over the past few years, I've had the opportunity to interview some of the best and brightest in the health and fitness space, from New York Times bestselling authors to Olympians and CrossFit Games athletes to NFL coaches to sports psychologists, you name it, a lot of the best and the brightest. And I have also interviewed my wife, Adi, 6 or 7 times. And without fail, the episodes that get the most engagement in terms of direct messages or mentions on social media or emails are all the ones that I do with her. And I think it has something to do with the authenticity of the conversations, the fact that we know each other a little bit better and can pull stories out of the other. And so we decided that we were going to start a second show, and the format is each episode is 20 to 30 minutes on a single topic with actionable steps after each. We talk about nutrition, personal development, mindset, and fitness. And so far, the response has been incredible. So if you're interested in the conversations that we've had on this show, I know you will love that one. So go check it out. Let me know what you think. Let's get into this episode. Robb Wolf, what's up, brother? It's such an honor to be here with you, man.
Hey, great to bring down property values on your amazing show. So I'm happy to be here.
Well put, man. So we got the opportunity to hang out just outside of PaleoFX in Austin recently. And for those of you who don't know PaleoFX is it's where all of the cutting edge kind of paleo products. That's kind of a funny way of putting it because paleo is the opposite of cutting edge in a lot of ways. But it's where a lot of the cutting edge brands and thought leaders go to network and to kind of collaborate. And so you and I got a chance to sit down for breakfast with our wives, and which was awesome. And I'm just curious, like what did you see this year, and what are you really excited about in the paleo industry in general? What did you see this weekend that you were really excited about?
Well, first, that was a far more generous assessment of that scene than what usually I call it the giant paleo nerd fest, which I feel is more honest. But gosh, man, what's new there? It's fascinating to me that the whole scene continues to grow. Years ago, at the very first PaleoFX, which I think was almost 10 years ago, like they always have this thing called the State of the Paleo Union, and it's kind of like, where are we now? Where are we going to go? And I made some predictions at that time that, somebody would take this kind of evolutionary medicine, Darwinian medicine look at diet and put a brandable, defensible, trademarkable name on it, take some almost arbitrary lane lines and just like stick them in and say, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. And that those folks were going to ride off into the sunset because people need really, strict lane lines, but you also need a technology or a methodology that's effective. And that was basically Whole30. And so I made some predictions early on that I think were very prescient and pretty spot on. I also kind of made the observation that this basic idea of kind of evolutionary biology applied to nutrition and medicine, it should have always been there. It should have always been a part of kind of the way that we do that process. And it's actually kind of odd the reasons why it's not more woven into it. But what I've noticed is that so like the gut microbiome story and kind of perspectives on autoimmune disease and whatnot, arguably the kind of, quote, paleo community really catalyzed interest in those areas. And now those ideas, or even just being okay to research those topics, is now part of the mainstream. Like I remember, I still have a image that I saved. It was a 2003, 2004 search on PubMed for the term intestinal permeability. And at that time, there were maybe like 300 citations, and all of it said that it was complete bunk. Like It was pseudoscience and complete bunk. And now when you go to PubMed and you put in the term intestinal permeability, is one of the second or third, highest suggested returns within that. And I want to say there's like 15,000 peer-reviewed papers at this point with that topic. And it's arguably one of the hottest areas of immunology research. And it's just this interface between cardiovascular disease, autoimmunity, neurodegenerative disease. And so it went from being completely fringe and unknown to just basically being woven into the fabric of kind of medicine and healthcare at large. And so what I see as being the future of this whole story is that these kind of effective methodologies and ways of looking at things, it's just going to get woven into the background. And someday we're not even going to put the term really paleo onto it. We might have some other term, maybe ancestral health sticks. That's not very sexy, though. Maybe it continues to be iterations of kind of like different people's interpretation of kind of paleo, kind of like the Whole30. But it's kind of like a computer operating system in my mind, and that, it's really effective. It's not the only way of doing things by any means, but it's particularly effective for, various disease processes, and effective in a way that acute medicine intervention, surgery, pharmaceuticals just really don't address. And so it's kind of here to stay, but I think that eventually we're not really going to have the terminology, paleo applied to it, but the methodology is just going to kind of become somewhat the default mode, the way that many practitioners, go about looking at the world. Yeah.
It's more like, putting different, like if there are going to be a ton of different diets out there in the future, this is just like the lens that we can put over any of those diets.
I suspect so. Like even circadian biology, like we're starting to understand that when we eat is reasonably important. Like still at the end of the day, calories are king. But what we're kind of discovering is that folks that generally eat maybe more of their calories earlier in the day, they spontaneously control caloric intake better than folks that eat more of their calories later in the day and stuff like that. And there's some interesting kind of circadian biology, evolutionary biology that kind of informs that process. So yeah, these different methodologies, I think this kind of evolutionary lens will be really helpful for providing some framework for why it works and integrating stuff beyond just the protein, carbs, fat, like the circadian biology and exercise and all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
Right. So on this episode, I want to, like, you've been one of the most consistent voices in the paleo world, the nutrition world for the past 10 plus years now. And so I want to take this opportunity to, like I said before the show, selfishly ask about a bunch of nutrition related things that I'm personally interested in. I want to talk about kind of how it all started for you and then where you're going now. But first, I know you told me you have a funny story about meeting Sublime.
Oh,
what happened, man?
Yeah. Oh, man. So this was 1992, and I was in Long Beach. In theory, I was going to school down there, but really what I was doing was doing a lot of Thai boxing and martial arts. And I had basically like education theater going on in the background to look like I was going to school, but I really hadn't sunk my teeth into that yet. And my boss at the time was a Long Beach native, and he all these people down there, they're like, oh, Sublime. I'm like, what is this thing? And I wasn't even really sure what ska was at this point. And then we went to this bar called The Clipper, which is on Anaheim Boulevard down in Long Beach, and everybody was talking about we were going to meet Sublime. And so we sat down at this table, and it's super loud. It's a pretty big bar, but it's not that big. And they had 3 different stages, and on each stage is a different ska band playing at the same time, and it's loud enough to fill up Yankee Stadium with any one of those players, And so I'm sitting across from a dude who's like shaved head and tattoos everywhere, and this was at a time where this was not like what everybody looked like. Like it was, I'm from like rural Northern California. Like this was kind of like, little risque stuff, but I'm just kind of trying to deal with my eardrums getting blown out and everything. And also wanted to just, strike up a conversation with somebody. So there's a guy sitting across from me, and I finally, I kind of get his attention, and it's so loud in this place. It's just unbelievable. But literally just as I yell at this guy, hey, who is Sublime? Just as I say that, literally all 3 bands stop. Like the music they're playing at that moment stopped. So I basically yell into what is now a dead quiet bar, who is Sublime? And this was like all of these guys were sitting there, and he sat back and just kind of like Buddha, spread his palms upright. And he's like, dude, we are Sublime, which is all meta on a bunch of different levels. Yeah. But yeah, so I wanted the earth to open up and eat me at that moment. But yeah, that was my brush with Sublime.
That's hilarious, man. Thanks for telling that. So you're known as the paleo guy, and now even sometimes the keto guy. Where did this all start for you? When did you realize that a low carb diet worked really well for you personally?
Man, I've always tinkered with nutrition. Both my parents were pretty ill. They smoked, they drank. I had this sneaky suspicion that if I ate in a way and lived in a way different than they did, that I might have a better chance at health. I remember doing diabetic wound care on my dad's foot as he got pieces of it amputated. And that just didn't look like a lot of fun to me, So
Yeah.
I did a lot of tinkering with nutrition. I was a state powerlifting champion in my youth and did kind of a standard high protein, high carb diet for that, and had a reasonable amount of success. But in my tinkering, I shifted towards first a vegetarian and then ultimately a very low fat, all plant-based vegan type diet. And for me, it just didn't work very well. Like looking back at my genetics and kind of the genetics that my mom has, she had a whole host of autoimmune diseases. She had celiac disease, which is a gluten-related autoimmune condition. And I was just ravaged by GI problems, which were ultimately whittled down to kind of a combination of irritable bowel disease, but mainly ulcerative colitis. And it was so bad that at the age of around 26, 27, I was facing a bowel resection. And I was in pretty rough shape. And I had done everything to try to figure out how to make this kind of vegan approach to things work. I went to the Georgia Shawa Macrobiotic Institute. I was a naturopathy student at Bastyr University. I consulted with Dr. John McDougall, and it was basically what I was getting back was you just need to write it out. Your body's detoxing. But I was maybe like 2 going 3 years into this. And
Damn.
when I was a state powerlifting champion, I'm 5'9". I was about 181 pounds. Almost squatting and deadlifting 600 pounds, like pretty strong. I could flat foot dunk a tennis ball. Like I couldn't run and do a layup because I wrestled instead of doing jiu-jitsu or basketball. So I had no idea how to do that, but I was really reasonably strong, reasonably athletic. And I tried to maintain my training volume and intensity. I was eating 4,500 calories a day from a vegan diet, but I mean, it was just going in one end and out the other. I mean, I wasn't digesting or absorbing anything. So, I was kind of at my wit's end with this whole thing. And looking back, I should have really abandoned ship earlier than I did. But I really, the people around me were telling me, hey, this thing works. You just got to give it time. And so I gave it time, but I just got progressively sicker. And kind of interestingly, the first exposure that I had to some sort of a low carb or like paleo type diet was actually an Atkins book. Like just on a lark, I picked up an Atkins book and he kind of talked a little bit about like hunter-gatherer societies and carbohydrate and actually talked a bit about grain intolerances and celiac. And then I got a phone call from my mother and she was just diagnosed with celiac disease around that time. So I started putting all those puzzle pieces together. And this was 1998 by this point. And so I was so sick, I was kind of like, well, if I die from heart disease from eating meat, then it's going to be better than dying from malabsorption disease eating this other stuff. And so, it's interesting, even though I kind of am, known more for like my work in, I guess, quote, the paleo diet realm, I've always been more on the low carb side of things because that's kind of my safe spot. And that was both beneficial for me early on. We opened I co-founded the first and fourth CrossFit affiliate gyms in the world. And it was really cool being able to have just hundreds, if not thousands of people to work with and see how these, different iterations of ancestral diets and low carb diets helped or didn't help people. And I was one of these folks that I definitely became a victim of my success in that for the people that a low carb diet works, it works so well that I assumed that it worked magically for everyone. But then as our clientele got more athletic, as we started doing more work with like MMA fighters and grapplers, and then as the CrossFit Games became a thing, it took me a while of breaking people to realize, oh, if you're metabolically healthy and you have good insulin response and you mind your caloric load, carbohydrates are in fact not the devil, and that they are in fact a critical part of a healthy equation for a more athletic and metabolically healthy population. And so, it's been really efficacious and beneficial for me. I've been able to help a lot of people, particularly in the kind of autoimmune and gut related scene. Like that was poop problems are not as sexy as abs, but that was definitely what I became really good at. And so I've dedicated a ton of my time to working with folks that had a lot of GI and kind of systemic inflammatory issues. And the funny thing is that work ended up catching the attention of some really fascinating entities. Like I ended up doing some work with NASA related to gut degeneration that happens in zero gravity environments. I had about an 8-year stint with the Naval Special Warfare Resiliency Committee, where I worked with a lot of the SEALs and the special boat teams. Because even though those guys are hard as nails, one of the first things that tends to go on them due to the stress of the work, the circadian disruption from like night ops and 6-month-long deployments and stuff like that, is that they end up with a lot of gut issues. And a couple of guys that were really high up the food chain within that community had benefited from my work and got me in there. And I ended up doing work with those folks for quite a long time. So it's interesting, even though I kind of focused on maybe like the sick and unathletic population, it's still kind of, there were many opportunities for working with kind of the most elite athletes, war fighters and whatnot. But again, largely from that kind of gut health perspective.
So this brings up one of the most, I think, interesting, sexy topics in nutrition, period, which is how do we, if at all, eat to optimize for performance, longevity, and possibly even body composition? So I talked to Andy Galpin a while back, and I know that you guys are intending to go on the Joe Rogan show to talk about longevity versus performance. And it seems to me, I got to have breakfast with you and I've seen you in the flesh. It seems to me that you may have cracked the code on your own body in terms of optimizing for body composition, as well as longevity. Like you're probably the leanest that I've ever seen you. And I assume that you're also eating to live well into your 150s. So how have you actually cracked that code? And what are your thoughts on trying to optimize 2 to 3 of those all at once?
Oh man. Well, the performance piece is interesting. Like my main performance objectives are being functional at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is kind of my passion and my outlet. And then beyond that, I just want to be as mobile and active and have as much fun with my kids as I can. I'm 47 and I have a 7-year-old and 4-year-old daughter, soon to be 5 years old on the younger. And so I kind of got into the mix a little late in the scene. And so I want to be as healthy and active as long as I can for the girls. And, when I think about like the performance side, I think about the things that we lose with aging, like the loss of explosive power production, those big type 2B motor units and whatnot. And so I try to orient my training to stave off the loss of those things, maintain a decent amount of muscle mass, but even more specific to muscle mass, like the neuromuscular junction, so that those things don't go away, they don't die. Shot putters and kind of sprint athletes tend to age really effectively in that regard. Like they lose power production over time, but they lose it at a much gentler slope than, other populations. And so I've tried to pull some elements out of the training with that. I really try to keep an eye on.
How does that show up in your, sorry for interrupting, but how does that show up in your training?
So I do Fred Hatfield? Did you follow Fred Hatfield's
I don't, no.
work? He died maybe two years ago. He was the first person to squat over 1,000 pounds, and he squatted it at, I want to say, a body weight of like 206 pounds, and he was 46 years old. Yeah. And a really brilliant guy, like just an amazing dude. on my podcast, I got to interview him before he died, and God, what an amazing guy. But he had this concept called rate of force, compensatory acceleration. Basically, he made it early on. I mean, ages before there was West Side Barbell and these ideas about like conjugate method and stuff like that. He basically made this case that whatever you do, if you're an athlete, you should do it fucking fast. It should be like, bam, like you turn stuff on and you go. And that's just kind of the way that I've always trained. And it doesn't mean that you're a spaz, but like if I did some, kind of supersets of dumbbell bench press and dumbbell rows yesterday. And I get a weight that is reasonably heavy, but I have to recruit to get it, but like I can still get the rep done in less than a second, and I can accelerate through the whole movement. Now, again, from like a purely hypertrophy standpoint, I'm not really doing myself a ton of favors doing that because I'm not getting a ton of time under tension. Like, to the degree I get some muscle mass out of that, it's more from like volume than it is that time under tension concept. But like, even though I'm like 170 pounds, I'm not super strong, but like when I need to recruit, I can really turn some stuff on, you know, whether it's sprinting or jumping or what have you. But the movements that I do, I try to, I get a weight that's heavy, but that I'm not grinding, and I really accelerate on it. And I typically, somewhere in the like 3 to 5 rep range. I don't really play much above that. I think I've lifted for so long that it just doesn't really do a whole lot for me at this point. I do a little bit of implement throwing, like shot put type stuff and kind of hammer throw type things with kettlebells. Because you really can get some great rate of force development with those things. Very light medicine balls also. Even just getting a T-ball set up. We live on 2 acres in Reno, and I'll just set up some baseballs or softballs and get a standard old baseball bat and just like right-handed and left-handed, like tee off and hit those things. Awesome. I will still throw some tie kicks every once in a while, mainly for that rate of force development story.
Yeah.
So that's kind of on the training side. Like I'm trying to do things explosively, controlled descent, but a very powerful and explosive contraction. And I really, on the physical performance side, I think that's done a lot of good for me. I pull a lot of joint mobility work and joint prep work out of gymnastics. So my elbows, shoulders, knees, I do a lot of kind of funky angle movement stuff, loading my connective tissue in kind of odd directions so that I'm not just habituated to like, bench press, standing press. Like I'm getting loading in a lot of other angles. And
what are good resources for that if anybody wants to look into it?
A good friend of mine, Coach Christopher Summer, has an online program, Gymnastics Bodies, and it's a challenge because you move slowly. Like if you are Mach 10, hair on fire, and you want to make all kinds of like immediate progress, it's not the thing for you. Yeah. I'm not sure what to do beyond that because this joint prep stuff, it just takes, he has it all broken down, but like he has, how long it takes to remodel muscle is on the order of weeks, tendons are months, bones are years. And he has these, when he trained some of the most successful youth gymnasts that have plugged into then the adult gymnastics programs, he had their training planned out like 8 years in advance. Like they're going to be here, then they're going to be here. And he had these very specific benchmarks. Yeah, a lot of people don't know much about Coach Summer, but he's fluent in both Mandarin and Cantonese. He has a master's degree in mathematics, and he was a code breaker for the Army when he was in the military.
Wow.
So that dude is really, really smart. And it kind of, that kind of math mind and that organizational mind bleeds over into his programming.
That is so fucking cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm hard pressed to find somebody smarter or a better resource for like joint prep type stuff than the Gymnastics Bodies program. But people are so impatient that they don't appreciate that this thing is a years long process, right. But you're going to make incremental, progress over time. And just so long as you're better next year than you were this year, then that's a net win, particularly when you start getting older, and instead of things going backwards. And then, on the nutrition side, it's interesting because there's a lot of controversy around what does effective aging look like. But an interesting thing that we can pull from non-Westernized populations, hunter-gatherer groups, horticulturalist groups, they don't age the way that Westerners do. They tend to maintain a significantly higher degree of overall health and performance into advanced age, and then they die. They have a very compressed morbidity and mortality window, and we tend to see something more like that in most kind of masters athletes populations. But a really interesting characteristic of these non-Westernized populations, they maintain phenomenal glucose homeostasis throughout their whole life. There was a really fascinating study that looked at a non-Westernized population versus a Westernized population throughout the lifespan. So they checked oral glucose tolerance in folks ranging from about 16 years old up to 70 years old. And they checked it at both the 1 hour point and the 2 hour point. And what was fascinating is that within the Westernized populations, very young people at that with that oral glucose tolerance test, which is administering somewhere between 50 and 100 grams of straight glucose and then checking the blood at various time points subsequent to that. The healthiest people were the youngest people, which would not be super surprising. But you didn't see at that 1 or 2 hour mark blood glucose levels below about 120 nanograms per deciliter. Like that was kind of the best, and that it within normal medical circles is considered to be pretty good. But what was fascinating is this non-Westernized population, the most aged people had better blood glucose response than the youngest people within Westernized populations.
Oh, wow.
And this was taken from the 1970s. And people have not gotten metabolically healthier over time.
Man.
And this is one of the things that does chap my ass a little bit, where people will dismiss the kind of paleo ancestral health idea out of hand. What your frame of reference is really matters. And when you say, well, the average blood glucose within this population is, X, or, within these bounds, that's all well and good, but that may or may not mean anything with regards to what it is beneficial at like a species level. And so these non-Westernized populations generally didn't eat super low carb diets, but the thing that's critical to take away is even if they ate a relatively high carb diet, their blood glucose response looked the way that I look when I eat a low carb diet. So even if they're eating 300-400 grams of starch from tubers or rice, their blood sugar barely gets up above like 90 or 100 ever. And that just isn't the case within the bulk of Westernized populations. And this is where there's this like massive pissing match within, like the if it fits your macros folks versus paleo folks versus low carb. And it's just kind of a point of nuance, which is there are populations that historically have been very healthy eating either high carb or low carb. But when we start looking at Westernized populations where we're eating a lot of processed food, maybe antibiotics have been problematic, sleep is disordered, our circadian biology is disordered, these folks just generally don't handle carbohydrate load the same way. And I would make the case that when we start getting blood sugar excursions up above even about 115, 120 nanograms per deciliter, I think that that's a problem. Now, it's kind of crazy talk because that's well within the bounds of what's considered healthy for Western populations, but it is not remotely normal or healthy for non-Westernized populations. And so I think when we look at that, using that as kind of an orienting tool, and I know you guys are just getting ready to do some of the 7-day carb test stuff that I recommended from Wired to Eat. When you're armed with that, then you can get a sense of where you are on that carbohydrate tolerance spectrum. And then you can use that to inform what you want to do. And I really do think that finding appropriate glycemic load is a kind of non-negotiable feature of effective aging. And for some people, they're going to be able to eat a a 70% carbohydrate diet and they're going to crush the world with that. And then for people like me, like I kind of hover around that peri-ketogenic level. I'll go, 30 grams one day. I might be 120, 130 grams on a day where I do a double day of jiu-jitsu, and there's a bunch of like 200-pound police officers in there that are trying to take my arms home with them. But it doesn't really get much beyond that. And that's been really effective for me. And I feel better now than what I did probably in my 20s.
So just to bring this back to the original question, I asked how do we eat to optimize for performance, body composition, and longevity? So basically, you're saying that in your experience, what's worked for you is a low carb diet just seems to work best for all of those.
For sure, but I think the takeaway for everybody is finding an appropriate protein intake so that we get satiety and we can maintain muscle mass as we age. Like that's a non-negotiable feature. And then whether you go high carb or low carb, then in my opinion is largely driven by what your kind of metabolic flexibility is, your metabolic state. And I think that it would make sense to use some of those ancestral cut points as orienting kind of guideposts to say, well, what would I like my average blood glucose to be? Like,
right.
Is it if I really want to be healthy, do I want to look at a Western population as my cut point, or do I want to maybe look at some non-Westernized populations that age in a very different way? And again, what that means in practice may be quite different from person to person, but we're still using those endpoint goals of what do the blood sugar excursions really look like. And for some people, they're going to do great on rice and grains and potatoes and fruits. And for other people, they're just most likely going to do much better at a lower glycemic load.
And guys, if Rob just mentioned this, but if you're interested in testing yourself to see how you respond to different carbohydrates, he breaks down in detail a 7-day carb test in his book, Wired to Eat. So I highly recommend you guys check that out. Adi and I have some what's called continuous glucose monitors that will monitor our response to different carbohydrates over the course of a week or two. So if someone's, I know that you're really big on people identifying their goals in nutrition, which I really love. So if someone's main goal is, like, their primary goal is to get leaner, lose body fat, and their secondary is to be healthier, do you think they should focus on quality or quantity first? If they want to dial in certain habits and they only, their attention span is only so much, they can only do kind of one thing at a time, where should they direct their attention first and why?
Oh man, in general, my knee jerk is to orient folks a little bit towards the qualitative nature of food, because whole unprocessed foods, minimally processed foods, tend to be more satiating. I think it's easier to get a net caloric, deficit if the person's trying to lose body fat, but that's not an across the board, truth. There are some people that they're more like a nutritional accountant. Like, they love counting out their protein, carbs, fat, and they like spreadsheets and stuff like that. And so I would have to take that a little bit as a case by case basis, but I might orient it. It is a totally arbitrary number, but maybe 75% of people I think would probably do better from mainly focusing on a whole food approach. Get your protein dialed in, do a little bit of blood sugar testing to figure out if you do better at the higher or the more moderate carbohydrate intake. And then that will kind of dictate where the remaining calories go. And then we can, hopefully the real trick, and you guys do this so incredibly well, is just finding what is an approach. If somebody's trying to lean out, ideally, this is something that just happens spontaneously. They're not like dreaming about eating their own arm, during the whole process. And so, a higher protein intake tends to be very beneficial in that regard, tends to be more satiating. We get a greater thermic effect. And then from there, it's reasonably individual. Like some people seem to get this really potent anorexigenic effect where they literally they eat higher carb, but they actually are more satiated from higher carb. Mm-hmm. There's some people that they find that they get hungrier more frequently with a higher carb intake. And I think that those are the folks that tend to have a little bit of disordered insulin signaling. And so they tend to get into high blood sugar highs and lows. So again, I think I would mainly orient the bulk of people towards a qualitative nature, but clearly you've got to keep an eye on, the total amount that you're consuming. So we could start a lot of people with like, okay, focus on kind of whole unprocessed foods, like we could call it paleo or whole foods or what have you. And you could make a case potentially that just shooting from the hip, if you just get people to hit a protein minimum, mm-hmm. like a gram and a half of protein per pound of lean body mass as a start, and then just like, hey, fill in from there with whole unprocessed foods. Right. For a ton of people, that's going to be really effective. I doubt that you're going to get them super lean on that, but that would be a phenomenal way to, get them leaner, arguably more metabolically healthy. And then we can play around with maybe on, training days, there's a little bit of a caloric, higher caloric intake. On rest days, there's a lower caloric intake. So we do a little bit of a zigzag diet where, there's more and fewer calories consumed at various points, which I think can be kind of nice for breaking things up and kind of effective for a long-term strategy of leaning out. But again, there are some people that the qualitative nature of the food won't matter as much, just so long as we keep them on point with, again, usually like you've got to really make sure that you get the protein dealt with, and then, they can weigh and measure Pop-Tarts and whatever else, and they'll be able to affect some body composition changes. And almost inevitably, if we lean people out, we see some improved health parameters. I think the one caveat that I'd throw in there with that is there are a good number of people that have serious GI problems that the qualitative nature is really going to be the only way that they ultimately get ahead of that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I want to throw this out there mainly because I'm interested in how you might kind of poke holes in this advice. So this is something that I'll often talk about kind of as an answer to this question. Usually I would recommend people start like if they absolutely, and this is just a thought experiment. Usually we can kind of focus on both at the same time, but if we had to, I would say focus on quality or quantity first, because from what I've read, which is 1/1000th of what your experience in nutrition science, it seems to me like the quantity has a bigger effect on body composition. And most people, like what we want them to do is feel, I think we want them to feel confident in their ability to control their decisions about food rather than just being driven by their subconscious and just driven out of bad habits. And I think if we can get them developing some habits about controlling the quantity, they will see body composition results, which will then result in confidence and an increased sense of integrity in themselves, which then I think gives them more power to control the quality, then even control the timing if they want to focus on that later. And so I think by giving them the power to have more control over their body composition, I feel like gives them more power over controlling all of the other factors. What do you think of that?
I think it's spot on, and this is where it's kind of sounds like I'm talking out of both sides of my head, but I'll give what's hopefully a good example here. My good friends that run keto gains, like those guys just get some really phenomenal results. And what's fascinating to me is they end up focusing on both the qualitative and quantitative nature simultaneously and super aggressively. Mm-hmm. Like they're really pretty neurotic about focusing on whole unprocessed foods. Like they're grudging about like, okay, do a shake or do this. Like they really hold folks' feet to the fire for a pretty long period about sticking with, like turkey and chicken and broccoli, the qualitative side. But then they get pretty neurotic about the macronutrients. And where there was a period in my career where if somebody was stalled, and they're like, oh, I think it's my thyroid or my hormones, I would be more inclined to side with that. And then after watching these guys, and it's really interesting because they'll do kind of a good cop, bad cop within their community. One of them one day will be a dick and the other one's the nice, nurturing person they trade. But just, man, time and again, I would be like, okay, so this person really sounds like hormonally broken. And they're like, no, bullshit. They're cheating. They're cheating somewhere. And those guys will pick and fiddle. And then eventually the person like has this huge emotional outpouring. They're like, yeah, I've been cheating, and the whole thing. And so I do think that you're spot on with that, and the thing that I've gotten from those guys is that the quantitative piece is really where like the jaw-dropping body composition changes happen because that caloric load is so important. But what I've found is that if we can focus also on that qualitative nature, it seems like we just get better satiety. Like people are not quite as hungry. These whole foods tend to fill folks up a little bit better. And so I think that the optimum is kind of both, to the degree that you can really sink your teeth into both. And I have to admit, probably because I don't know if it's because I was a chemist and I weighed and measured everything in my life, that when I got into the nutrition stuff, I really focused on kind of like a shooting from the hip kind of like, okay, get protein and then we'll just kind of let it sort out from there. But it is doing a disservice to people if they're not making the progress that either of you would expect, and there isn't sufficient detail to the amount, to the quantitative nature, then you're clearly doing a disservice to those people. But it's a great point. And, you guys have had such amazing success. Like how have you guys seen that play out on kind of a percent type basis? Like when do you see like the quantitative plus qualitative? Does it give you 10% more control, 20% more control? Does it not really matter that much? It's mainly just like get the quantitative element dialed in and everything's going to fall into place from there. Well,
it's funny you ask. I think of this more as like a fun thought experiment, but we also believe in both and. So our nutrition pyramid is adherence or lifestyle on the bottom, compliance next. Then actually I might be getting it wrong. I think it's lifestyle, whole, nutrient dense whole foods, then compliance. So the lifestyle piece is like find a diet that people can actually stick with. So we're focusing on all of it at the same time as well. I mainly just like it as a talking point.
For sure. Yeah.
Like most things in life, I think it's usually both and there's like a gray area. But I also wonder like if a coach, right, if a nutrition coach wants to take the approach of just starting really, really basic and simple and just giving this person one thing to focus on, which is actually something we ascribe to occasionally, like just implementing one habit at a time. Do we say, I only want you to eat unprocessed organic foods or some version of like a qualitative measure, or do I want to tell you I want you to hit this number on protein every day? And so I just think it's an interesting question.
For sure. Yeah. And I think that this is where like just having a lot of tools in the toolbox are pretty handy. And it was a hard lesson for me to learn. It would be so awesome if just one size fit everybody and all I needed was a screwdriver and that fixed everything. But that's just unfortunately not the case. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. What's the most common advice that you give that you think could have the biggest effect on people, but the fewest people actually follow through?
Oh man. I think it's probably that you're only one meal away from being back on track. Like, people will get so wrapped around the axle of, oh, I went off plan and now I fucked it all up and I'm just done. And it's like, let's assume you eat 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. That's 21 meals. Unless you go and like close down a buffet and get kicked out of it and you consume like 8,000 calories in a sitting, you know, it's like, let's say like 10%, maybe two meals out of the 20 or 21 are kind of like off plan. Is that really going to completely derail you? And again, this is assuming that we don't have like overt health issues like celiac or some gut thing where it's like people really need to dot the I's and cross the T's. But from just kind of like a general health and body composition perspective, far too many people will make the process so rigid that if they get one deviation off their mark, then they're done. They just throw in the towel, and they may be 3 months into the process. And then it's kind of like, you know, your early 20s relationships where you start thinking, man, I don't know if I want to be with this person. And then you start creating this whole crazy list of grievances in your head and like provoke the person into meeting the list of grievances. And you're like, okay, I'm justified in breaking up with you now, you know, and people kind of do that with their nutrition approach versus whatever approach that you're eating. Let's say you're traveling and you just get presented with shitty options. Okay, just do the one meal that's not great options, and then, you know, get on your phone and you're like, okay, I'm staying at this hotel. What are the restaurants around there? Okay, for breakfast, this place looks good. I'm going to be back on point. And then it was one deviation instead of 2, and then 3, and then 5. And then all of a sudden, you know, if you're 50-50 being completely off plan versus on plan, then yeah, we've got a serious problem. But I would say that maybe the biggest mistake that folks commit and that is really hard to get them to listen to is that they're literally one meal away from being back on track.
That's phenomenal advice. And that really goes for, in my opinion, anything in life, like anything that you're working towards. If you make a mistake, the worst thing that you could do is tell yourself, you know, it's over and say, F it, right? I see this in Alcoholics Anonymous so badly. It's such an all or nothing program. And I know from personal experience that works really well for a certain amount of time. But when some people, they have one drink, I think part of the reason it turns into, you know, possibly years of more drinking is because there is this black and white mentality, this all or nothing, that makes them feel ashamed when they make a mistake, right? If you've gone 10 years and you have one slip up and it's a beer, you have nothing to be ashamed about. Right. You just had 10 years of sobriety, and, you know, if you were working the steps, then you likely had a really happy time along the way, or really fulfilling time along the way. So when you make a mistake along the way to a goal or on a path, just get right back on the path. That's phenomenal advice.
Oh, thanks. It's very simple, but it was hard won. That's for sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
What's the most frustrating piece of advice you see nutrition and health coaches giving out today?
Oh, man. It's really tough because on the one hand, people are buried in information. Like, there's so much information, so many differing accounts. You've got vegan and paleo and carnivore and keto, and you see examples of success within all of these camps, and you see examples of abject failure from all of these camps, you know? And I think that the maybe not so much specific. It's hard if you're in this space and you're trying to make a living doing it. There's an interesting balance between you can't bury people with details, at least not right out of the gate. Like, it's kind of a stepwise process. It's kind of like somebody's first day at jiu-jitsu. You teach them a little bit of base, a little bit of posture. It's kind of like your first day of a language class. It's like, you know, hello, my name is whatever, where is the bathroom? Yeah. Like, you start with some really, really basic stuff, and then you start building and iterating from there. And so on the one hand, these very general 30,000 foot level concepts are kind of critical for bringing in the next layer of people. There was just a report that said that fewer than 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy. And I would actually argue that that's using modern cut points, and virtually nobody is metabolically healthy. But we have some massive, health issues that are looming with type 2 diabetes, neurodegenerative diseases, which are largely metabolically driven. So on the one hand, we really do need to get a message out to the masses that's effective and can start affecting change. But then the reality is the techniques that are used, whether it's paleo or if it fits your macros or keto or what have you, some people, it's kind of like, some people are into this rock band versus that rock band. Like it's almost like a personal constitution type of scenario. And we have to figure out what fits for them. And then even within that, there's all this iteration. There was an amazing paper that was just written. I'm blanking on the exact title, but it was something to the effect of, in the age of personalized medicine, what does big data really mean for anyone? And the point that they were making is that when we do these massive studies and we take ideally a couple of thousand people and aggregate all their data and then create a bell curve, that's all well and good, but it's almost meaningless unless you are the person that exists exactly in the middle of that bell curve.
Yeah.
Just the rate of clearance of caffeine out of one system. Some people will clear 100 milligrams of caffeine out of their system in 4 hours. Some people, it takes 30 plus hours to clear caffeine. And this is a classic dose response curve, which there is a massive delta within the population. And I think that we have similar deltas with regards to carbohydrate tolerance and maybe what type of fats people do well with and fiber. And so the challenge is that we try to take these general concepts, take these 30,000 foot level stories to help people start moving in a good direction. But then what happens is these very general stories get written into stone and turned into religious dogma. And then it becomes almost impossible to auger down and get the specifics that individuals need. And I think that there's an interesting push-pull that occurs there where we need these generalized stories to give people like a frame of reference, but then what is specifically necessary for one person may be very different, compared to their spouse or their sibling or, just a coworker. So I don't know that it's as far as something that frustrates me, it's specifically bad advice. It's just the difficulty of articulating, on the one hand, a simplistic enough story that we don't just turn off everybody. You've got to make it accessible, but then no matter what recommendation that we throw out there, it usually only applies to maybe 80% of people, or it addresses maybe 80% of their needs. And then we need to start augering in and getting more specific and customizing. And that's kind of a laborious process.
Right. Rob, have you read Homo Deus by Yuval Harari?
I have, yeah.
So this reminds me of what he talks about. He talks a ton about the difference between religion and spirituality, right? We want so deeply to have a set like concrete beliefs to follow, right? Which is these different diets. But what brings us what helps us really transform a lot of times is spirituality, which is an individual pursuit, like a going within. It doesn't have anything to do with rules or systems. And I see a lot of that in this conversation, right? We have all of these different diets, but what is ultimately probably going to be best for us is to do some experimentation and figure out what works for us.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's funny when I look at the folks that are really setting the world on fire. They usually have a very simplistic story that they're selling, and oftentimes it's still very, very beneficial, but you're kind of fingers crossed that the bulk of the story fits the bulk of the people sufficiently that they make enough progress that they don't bail on the whole process, and then they can seek out other folks that can kind of fill in the nuance and get to that more, to your point, like kind of individualized, like spiritual type level with that.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's talk about jiu-jitsu for a second. What are your favorite principles from jiu-jitsu that you've implemented in your life? And I'll give you a specific example of one for me. One of my favorites that I learned from Hiron Gracie is that it is this idea of just accepting that you are where you are on the mat or in life rather than resisting it. So when you do that, when you accept rather than resist, then you're able to take action with a clear mind. He taught me that there is no quote unquote bad position in either mat or life. There's just the position that you're in, and then you just have options of what you can do. What are one or two or more of your favorite principles that you've implemented?
Oh man, that's a really good question. There's this kind of comedy group. They're called the Axis of Awesome, and they do this gig where they play like all the modern pop songs using only 4 chords, and they go from like Hotel California to Britney Spears, and they just like cycle through all this stuff, but they're basically using 4 chords that they kind of repeat over and over again. And so I'm definitely more of a lumper. Like I tend to lump things together and try to find really big commonalities. And within jiu-jitsu, one of my coaches kind of broke jiu-jitsu down to you need base, which is kind of how you're connected to the planet, and then you need posture, and then connection is the way that you are interacting with the other person. And only once base, posture, and connection are properly kind of squared away, then you can apply pressure. And that's the way that we start getting some stuff done. And that has definitely been interesting, in even just kind of verbal interactions with people. Like if I'm feeling ungrounded or in kind of a weird spot, I'm kind of like, okay, what's my base and posture and how am I connected to this person? And it's really interesting because if I have a jiu-jitsu technique that's not going well, inevitably I'm like, okay, what's my base? Okay, it's this. That seems okay. What's my posture? Oh, my posture sucked. That's why my connection was off. And so when I applied pressure, things weren't working. And so definitely that like 4 chord element of jiu-jitsu, base, posture, connection, and pressure, I've noticed some overlaps within the rest of my life. And then I don't know if one of the greatest things that for me, like I've had a modicum of success within the world that I've been in, and it can be very easy for folks once they get some success in one area to kind of hide there and not be a beginner or an idiot. Yes. It's something new. And I remember a good friend of mine who's reasonably well known within the kind of health and wellness space. This was probably close to 10 years ago. He was like, hey, Rob, we can't let anybody know that we're white belts in jiu-jitsu. Like it was kind of known that we dabbled in it, but like I wasn't at a school consistently or anything. And I looked at him, I'm like, why would it be a problem to let people know that we're white belts at jiu-jitsu? And he's like, well, it just doesn't it's not consistent with the image of success and whatnot. And it was really perplexing to me. And this person is kind of flamed out within this space over the course of time. And I can't help but wonder if it's because of maybe this kind of ego attachment to, the way that you want to be perceived. But the only way that, to the degree I've gotten better, like in theory, this summer, I might be getting a brown belt at some time, which is more of a sign of the declining standards in jiu-jitsu than me getting better. Yeah. But I just fucking show up and I listen to my coaches and I ask questions. I try to be super engaged and really pay attention. And I think I've been really good at seeking out folks that are very, very good at simplifying. Like I'm old enough and busy enough that I can't do a super complex game. But the point there was that even though I'm reaching a modicum of success or aptitude within Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's only come about because I was willing to go put on a white belt and get the snot beat out of me. And I would be rolling with people and they're like, hey, you were on Joe Rogan. You're that guy on Joe. Yeah, I was. Okay. Yeah. And you just choked me 10 times, And so it's because I had some books that sold reasonably well and stuff like that. Doesn't mean that I'm going to be good at jiu-jitsu at all unless I put the same degree of effort and focus into that I put into other areas of my life. So I think that shifting gears and being willing to be the newbie, even if you have success in other areas, is really, really valuable.
So kind of along those same veins, what is your learning process like in jiu-jitsu? How do you, if you're optimizing for, learning as quickly as possible, how do you go about doing that? And are there any parallels with how you, focus on writing a new book or researching a new topic?
Man, I guess if anything, it's kind of a less is more kind of scenario. Like it's interesting. Usually purple belt is typically the longest belt for most people. And mine's going to end up being seemingly relatively short. And I think that's because most folks, when they hit purple belt, it's kind of when you start figuring out your style and your game. But a lot of people, when they run into problems, what they assume that they're lacking is another technique. Right. And so they become the technique encyclopedia. They just keep looking and looking and looking for more and more techniques. Whereas I think maybe because I'm older and in this and have learned that trying to figure out heuristics and really what are these 80-20 things? Like what are the 20% of things I should do that is successful 80 or 90% of the time? And I sought out some people like Henry Akins, John Frankel, our local coach here, Ray Price, who's part of the Straight Blast gym scene. They just have a philosophy that is the less is more. That white belt jiu-jitsu is really the only jiu-jitsu. And it's not super complex. It's not super attribute driven, even though for a nearly 50-year-old guy, I'm in pretty good shape. I do jiu-jitsu in a way that I wouldn't have to do it any different when I'm 80. Like right. I'm not constantly relying on my strength and speed and power. And so every 5 or 10 years, I won't need to go back in and redo my jiu-jitsu game because I'm a little slower and a little weaker and all that stuff. And so I definitely think that less is more orientation has been really valuable for me and super streamlined the process. In talking to Henry Akins, he's the guy that got a black belt from Rickson Gracie, the fastest out of all of Rickson's black belts. And he said that at this point, there's probably about 10,000 cataloged moves or techniques within the totality of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but he knows and uses maybe about 120, 130. Mm-hmm. And so he has a very, quote, simplistic game, but God, he does it so well. Yeah. Like it's just... there's a bunch of things. He's like, yeah, I don't really know how to do that. I don't know how to do that. So yeah. He's not that guy that's a 1,000,001 techniques, but the stuff he does, he's so on point with it. And it's interesting. Maybe about a year and a half ago, he had a pretty severe motorcycle accident and he broke a wrist, broke a jaw, like really serious. He could have died from it. And my coach, John Frankel, has been a black belt like 15 or 20 years now, and he trains with Henry also. And he had been training with Henry, and then Henry got injured. John went to train with him, and he like texted me, and he was like, dude, Henry is like twice as good as he was before. Wow. I'm like, really? And he's all, yeah. And he's like, I just can't believe it. And then when I went to a jiu-jitsu camp in Costa Rica with Henry, I'm like, dude, Henry, John said that you were like twice as good. He's like, oh, that's so cool to hear. He said, I've been working on being more and more relaxed and efficient with my game. And he was so deconditioned and injured after his motorcycle accident that he just couldn't do any crazy scrambly stuff. And so even though this guy is kind of lauded as being one of the best as far as efficiency and simplicity in his game, his injury made him arguably like twice as good as what he was before. Because instead of getting in, even though he's like, I need to get in the gym and I need to get back in shape, but getting in shape was not his answer. Getting more efficient so that his jiu-jitsu could match his current physical state was his answer. And I thought that was just a really, profound insight. And it's something that I've definitely been trying to take to every area of my life, like that efficiency and working smarter, not harder, which is not easy to do. Like there's a tendency to do the exact opposite.
Oh man, that's such great advice. That last piece, the story you told, reminds me of two books. If anyone's interested, one is The Obstacle is the Way. So that's like a stoic. It's a stoic principle that Ryan Holiday wrote an entire book around of just using an obstacle in your life as a way to propel you forward. So Henry used this opportunity to not, it not only did it not hold him back, but he used it to further develop something that he was already trying to develop. And the second one is Josh Waitzkin's book, The Art of Learning. And he's specifically talking about, I think he's talking about jiu-jitsu. So he breaks his strong side arm, and instead of moping around and taking the time off, he continues sparring and develops his weak side. So it's this idea of using the obstacle as the way to propel you forward to higher and higher achievement. That's phenomenal, man. Yeah,
it's really cool. And Henry credits Rickson with learning this. He said, even though Rickson was a real physical specimen, Rickson's greatest advantage was his mind, because when Rickson came to the United States, there were no other people to train with. And when people would ask him, his students specifically, they're like, how do you get so good? And he's like, you guys. And they're like, how do we help you get good? But even though they were maybe white belts or blue belts and eventually purple belts, he would just do things like starting from a massive deficit. Like the person would have a cross collar choke, like 95% sunk. And then Rickson would figure out, can I get out of this by just changing the posture of my traps and not even using my hands, and all this stuff. And like when I roll with Henry, I can't get a rear naked choke on the guy no matter what I do. And he doesn't use his hands at all. It's 100% just how he changes his positioning and how he postures into my person. And I can't secure a choke on the guy. Wow. And so he's got that much buffer. Then it's kind of like, okay, if he needs to bring his hands in, he's got a huge buffer then, but he's able to nullify my whole back attack game just by the way he changes his posture and angle. And so so even, and I've been able to learn from these guys. And so a lot of my training is with my wife, who's getting close to being a blue belt now, but she's much smaller than I am. She's not as strong and all that stuff. But instead of getting in and just smashing her, which would be no value for either one of us, we'll start her in these kind of advantaged positions. And then I figure out how to work from them. And as she gets better, I have to like tighten the margin a little bit. But I've been able to make really phenomenal progress training with a white belt female. And I would argue that I'm making as faster progress of anybody that's going to like a super top of the food chain gym and just like training super hard with tough people 5 days a week.
That's it. Adi's doing jiu-jitsu now.
Once that hook sinks in, it's kind of the cocaine of movement. Like if the hook sinks in, it sinks pretty deep.
The cocaine of movement, man. I want a t-shirt. I want a meme, all of it. Lastly, man, what are you most fired up about right now?
Man, I'm really interested in this interface between health and sustainability. I think once you get your own health and wellness back, like you start popping your head up and looking around at the world, and we have kids, and so you think about like legacy in the future. And I'm really fired up about the sustainability topic, I'm working on a book with a good friend of mine, Diana Rogers, where we kind of look at regenerative agriculture and the very controversial notion that grazing animals might actually play a really important and beneficial role in a sustainable food system that could last indefinitely versus kind of the modern row crop system that we have right now. And so it's a very uphill battle, but I've noticed that I tend to be about 10 years ahead of where everything goes. And I was talking to Nikki and I'm like, just for once, I would like to be like in the mainstream of something, but I found CrossFit in 2001, and then we opened the first gym late 2003, and then the gym in Chico in 2004, and the paleo scene and all that jive. I wrote my first article about intermittent fasting in 2004. I want to say that was published, and so like we've just been really early with a lot of stuff, and I think this sustainability topic again, we're going to be pretty early to the scene, but I'm really excited about it because I think that there's some opportunities to improve the lot of humanity, writ large, but also not, hammer and destroy the planet in the process. And I'm on the board of directors of a medical clinic here in Reno, and 8 years ago we did a pilot study with the Reno Police, Reno Fire Department, where we found 40 people at high risk for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. We put these folks on kind of a lowish carb paleo type diet, modified their sleep and exercise as best we could. But based off the changes in their blood lipid parameters and their health risk assessment numbers, the pilot study is estimated to have saved the city of Reno about $22 million with a 33-to-1 return on investment. It was really, really powerful. And we've been slowly growing that thing over time, like the way the incentives are in healthcare. It's very difficult to get that thing going. But what's interesting is, as important as that healthcare piece is, our food system piece is a inseparable element of that. Like, we really have to deal with things like farm subsidies and the way that junk food is artificially inexpensive and stuff like that. So it's a really big, unsexy topic. People are typically way more excited about abs and glutes, but it's just kind of so I kind of use the abs and glutes as kind of the the smoke screen to get folks in and hopefully get them healthier. And then it's like, hey, now that you're better, what are we collectively going to do to try to improve the world and leave a legacy that's valuable?
Right. Well, regardless of timing, man, you are just laying groundwork for everyone that is interested in this and any future research that's being done on this. So thank you so much for the stand that you're taking in the world and all the work you're up to, man.
Oh, well, thanks, man. Thank you. And I just cannot say enough about the awesome work you guys are doing. Like, it's really jaw-dropping what you guys have achieved. And this is the cool thing of meeting new people in this space. Like, we learned so much hanging out with you guys, and it's definitely cool to see folks innovating and growing and figuring out new paths through this process. And it's great for Nikki and I, who've been in this a long time, but to be able to not need to invent everything on our own, to meet folks like you and to be able to learn from you and integrate that into what we're doing. It's really cool.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that. Where can people find out about all of the different books you've written and find out about what you're working on? Most everything is over at robbwolf.com. My main social media presence is on Instagram, and that is at @DasRobbWolf. And but at robbwolf.com, you'll find links to all that and the podcast and pretty much everything I've done over the last 12, 15 years on the interwebs. Awesome, man. Thank you so much for your time, Robb. We'll talk soon.
Take care.
This episode is finished, but your training journey continues. Head over to brutestrengthtraining.com/SSW and grab your free pack of 32 accessory workouts that you can incorporate into your training and start improving your strength immediately. That's brutestrengthtraining.com/SSW.